In 1953, the streets of Tehran erupted in chaos. CIA operatives moved through the shadows, orchestrating one of the most consequential coups in modern history. The democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown, and with him fell Iran's dreams of controlling its own oil wealth. This wasn't diplomacy. This was warfare by other means, the opening shot in a century-long campaign by Western powers to subjugate Iran through coups, economic strangulation, and proxy conflicts. The story of Iran isn't simply one of revolution and geopolitics. It's the story of how empires wage war without declaring it, how superpowers destroy nations while claiming to defend freedom, and how a proud civilization has endured over 150 years of sustained Western assault on its sovereignty. From the British Empire's economic colonization to America's modern maximum pressure campaigns, Iran has faced every weapon in the imperial arsenal except outright invasion. Iran sits at one of the world's most strategically important crossroads. Bordered by the Caspian Sea to the north and the Persian Gulf to the south, it controls vital shipping lanes through which 20% of the world's oil flows. The Strait of Hormuz, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, represents a choke point that could cripple global energy markets if closed. For over 2 centuries, this geography has made Iran a target for every empire seeking to dominate the Middle East and Central Asia. With 85 million people, vast natural resources, and a 2,500-year history of independent civilization, Iran has consistently refused to accept subordinate status to foreign powers. This defiance, this insistence on sovereignty in a region where Western powers demand client states has made Iran the target of sustained imperial warfare conducted through economic, political, and military means. The first systematic Western assault on Iranian sovereignty began in the early 1800s when the British and Russian empires launched what historians call the Great Game, a century-long struggle for control over Central Asia with Iran as the primary battleground. Rather than expensive direct colonization, both empires pioneered techniques of indirect control that would become the template for modern imperial warfare. Russia struck first in 1804, exploiting Iranian internal divisions to invade and seize Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. The humiliating Treaty of Gulistan in 1813 forced Iran to surrender nearly 20% of its territory while granting Russia extraterritorial rights, meaning Russian subjects in Iran could only be tried in Russian courts. When Iran attempted to reclaim these territories in the 1820s, Russia crushed Iranian forces and imposed the even more devastating Treaty of Turkmenchay, demanding war reparations equivalent to 2 years of Iran's entire government revenue. Britain perfected more subtle techniques of imperial control. Rather than direct territorial annexation, British forces intervened whenever Iran attempted to assert control over its traditional territories. When Iranian forces moved to reclaim Herat in 1856, historically part of the Persian Empire, British naval forces attacked Iranian ports while supporting Afghan resistance. The subsequent Treaty of Paris granted Britain the same extraterritorial privileges Russia enjoyed, effectively partitioning Iran between 2 foreign powers without formally ending its independence. These treaties established the template for modern Western warfare against Iran: economic exploitation backed by military threats, legal frameworks that favored foreign interests, and the systematic weakening of central government authority. Iran remained nominally independent while becoming a semi-colony exploited by competing empires. The economic consequences were devastating. British and Russian merchants, backed by their government's military power, drove Iranian craftsmen and traders out of business. Iran's once thriving textile industry collapsed under foreign competition, while traditional trade routes that had enriched Iranian cities for centuries were redirected to benefit colonial powers. The Bazaris, Iran's merchant class, saw their economic foundations destroyed by imperial free trade agreements that were anything but free. British imperial strategists understood that controlling Iran's economy was more effective than occupying its territory. In 1890, they achieved their greatest pre-oil victory when Shah Nasser al-Din granted the British Imperial Tobacco Corporation a monopoly over Iran's entire tobacco industry production, distribution, and export. This wasn't simply a business arrangement, it was economic colonization. Every Iranian who smoked tobacco would now enrich British investors rather than Iranian farmers. The monopoly covered not just commercial tobacco but even personal cultivation, meaning Iranian farmers couldn't grow tobacco for their own use without paying tribute to a British corporation. The popular response demonstrated Iran's capacity for organized resistance when its people united against foreign exploitation. Led by Ayatollah Mirza Hassan Shirazi, Iran's most revered religious leader, Iranians organized a nationwide boycott of tobacco products. The Ayatollah's fatwa declaring tobacco use religiously forbidden until the concession was cancelled was obeyed across the country. Even members of the royal harem reportedly refused to prepare the Shah's water pipe. The boycott's success forced the Shah to cancel the concession in 1892, but Britain extracted a cruel price for this victory. Iran had to compensate the British company for lost profits, requiring the government to take out its first major foreign loan. This debt trap forcing countries to borrow money to pay for resisting economic colonization would become a standard imperial technique used against Iran and other developing nations for decades to come. More significantly, Britain had demonstrated that Iranian resistance, no matter how successful, would be made economically painful. Iran could resist British economic penetration, but the cost would be measured in gold, debt, and economic dependency. The discovery of oil in 1908 transformed Iran from an imperial sideshow into the crown jewel of Western economic warfare. William Knox D'Arcy's 1901 concession granted his Anglo-Persian Oil Company ownership of all petroleum found across most of Iranian territory for 60 years. In exchange for just 16% of profits, the most exploitative resource extraction deal in modern history. When oil was struck at Masjid Suleiman, the British government immediately recognized its strategic importance. First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill convinced Parliament to purchase controlling shares in what became the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, making oil extraction from Iran a matter of British national policy rather than private business. The arrangement was designed to maximize British benefits while minimizing Iranian gains. Iranian oil powered the British Royal Navy through 2 world wars, fueled Britain's industrial economy, and generated enormous wealth, almost all of which flowed to London. The company's refinery at Abadan became the world's largest, processing Iranian crude for British and global markets while Iranian workers lived in company housing described by British managers as suitable only for natives. The racial and economic hierarchy was explicit and deliberate. British workers received substantial salaries, comfortable housing, and full medical care. Iranian workers doing identical jobs earned a fraction of British wages, lived without electricity or running water, and were denied access to company facilities reserved for Europeans. The company's books remained secret from Iranian authorities, making it impossible to verify whether Iran was receiving its promised share of profits. This system of resource extraction, combining legal ownership with racial hierarchy and financial opacity, became the model for Western economic warfare throughout the developing world. Iran's oil belonged to Iran in name only. In practice, it enriched British shareholders while impoverishing the Iranian people whose labor extracted it from the ground. World War II provided the West with an opportunity to perfect its techniques of indirect control over Iran. When Reza Shah attempted to maintain neutrality while keeping channels open to Nazi Germany, Britain and the Soviet Union jointly invaded Iran in 1941, deposing the Shah and installing his young son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as a puppet ruler. The occupation was brutal and systematic. Allied forces requisitioned food and supplies, causing inflation to soar by 400% while unemployment skyrocketed. Famine struck many regions as agricultural production collapsed under the strain of supporting foreign armies. Iran served as a crucial supply route for Allied aid to the Soviet Union, but received minimal compensation for the enormous damage to its infrastructure and economy. More importantly, the occupation demonstrated that Iran's independence existed only at the sufferance of foreign powers. The new Shah understood that his throne depended entirely on Western support, making him the ideal client ruler for the emerging American empire. Unlike his father, who had at least attempted to balance between competing powers, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi would serve Western interests exclusively. The post-war oil settlement revealed the new imperial hierarchy. American companies, led by Standard Oil, demanded their share of Iranian petroleum profits. After negotiations that excluded Iranian representatives, a new international consortium divided Iranian oil between British and American firms on a 50-50 basis. Iran's most valuable resource would now enrich two Western empires instead of one, while Iran itself remained a junior partner in exploiting its own natural wealth. This arrangement, using compliant local rulers to legitimize foreign economic exploitation, became the foundation of American imperial strategy throughout the developing world. Rather than expensive military occupations, the United States would maintain control through client regimes that appeared independent while serving Western interests. When Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh came to power in 1951 with a simple but revolutionary message that Iran's oil belonged to Iranians, he threatened the entire structure of Western economic warfare in the developing world. Mossadegh's nationalization of the oil industry wasn't just an Iranian policy. It was a direct challenge to the principle that Western companies should control the natural resources of non-Western nations. The Western response revealed the true nature of the international order they claimed to defend. Britain immediately imposed a comprehensive embargo on Iranian oil exports, using its naval power to intercept tankers while pressuring other nations to boycott Iranian petroleum. This wasn't free market competition, it was economic warfare designed to punish Iran for asserting control over its own resources. The embargo was devastatingly effective because it was backed by the collective power of the Western imperial system. International banks refused to extend credit to Iran's government, while Western allies were pressured to reject Iranian diplomatic initiatives. Iran's oil exports dropped from 250 million barrels in 1950 to just 9 million in 1952, creating economic chaos that threatened the government's survival. But economic warfare alone wasn't enough to topple a popular leader backed by his people as determination to end foreign exploitation. When Mossadegh retained power despite economic strangulation, the CIA and Britain's MI6 launched Operation Ajax, the first successful U.S. regime change operation of the Cold War era. The coup was meticulously planned and generously funded, with a budget of $1 million. CIA operatives, led by Kermit Roosevelt, spent months infiltrating Iranian society, bribing military officers, organizing pro-Shah demonstrations, and spreading propaganda portraying Mossadegh as a communist sympathizer threatening Iranian independence. The operation initially failed when loyal Iranian officers arrested those planning the overthrow, forcing the Shah to flee to Rome. But CIA operatives refused to accept defeat. Working with Iranian monarchists and disaffected military units, they organized massive street demonstrations that created the appearance of popular uprising against Mossadegh's government. On August 19, 1953, pro-Shah crowds stormed government buildings in Tehran, while sympathetic military units seized key installations. Mossadegh was arrested at his home, Iran's democratic experiment was terminated, and the Shah returned triumphantly from exile. The coup's success established the CIA as the primary instrument of American imperial power, while demonstrating that even popular democratic governments could be overthrown if they threatened Western economic interests. The new Iranian government granted Western oil companies even more favorable terms than before nationalization, with American firms receiving a 40% share equal to Britain's stake. Political parties were banned, press freedom was eliminated, and the parliament that had supported nationalization was dissolved. The restored Shah understood that maintaining power required more than Western support. It demanded the systematic suppression of Iranian nationalism and democracy. With American assistance, he built one of the world's most sophisticated police states, proving that client regimes could be even more effective than direct colonial administration in preventing resistance to Western domination. Savak, the Shah's secret police, was trained by the CIA and Israel's Mossad in the latest techniques of surveillance, interrogation, and psychological warfare. American advisors helped design Savak's organizational structure while providing equipment and training that made it one of the most feared intelligence services in the world. Torture of political prisoners became routine, with techniques taught by American and Israeli instructors who shared decades of experience in suppressing resistance movements. The police state's reach extended into every aspect of Iranian society. Universities were monitored for signs of political activity, while labor unions were either banned or brought under government control. Religious institutions, traditionally centers of Iranian resistance to foreign domination, were closely watched and their leaders frequently arrested. The press was subjected to strict censorship, with journalists facing imprisonment for any criticism of government policies or foreign influence. This systematic repression served Western interests perfectly by preventing any repeat of the nationalist movement that had brought Mossadegh to power. Iranians who might have organized resistance to foreign economic exploitation were instead focused on basic survival under an increasingly authoritarian regime. The Shah's police state had effectively neutralized Iranian nationalism, while maintaining the appearance of independent government. The economic benefits of this arrangement flowed primarily to Western corporations and their Iranian collaborators. American companies established operations throughout Iran, extracting profits while providing minimal benefits to ordinary Iranians. The Shah's family and inner circle became fabulously wealthy through corruption and preferential treatment, creating a comprador class whose interests aligned with continued Western domination rather than Iranian independence. Military sales provided additional benefits to American corporations while ensuring Iranian dependence on Western support. The Shah purchased billions of dollars in American weapons, making Iran one of the world's largest arms importers despite facing no serious external threats. These weapons purchases served multiple Western purposes, generating profits for American defense contractors, creating Iranian dependence on American spare parts and training, and providing justification for continued American military presence in Iran. By the 1970s, the contradictions of the Western imperial system in Iran had become unsustainable. The Shah's modernization programs, while creating impressive statistics, had disrupted traditional social structures without providing adequate alternatives for most Iranians. The monarchy's 1971 celebration of the Persian Empire's 2,500th anniversary costing an estimated $300 million, while millions of Iranians lacked basic necessities, symbolized the regime's disconnect from its people's needs. Foreign dignitaries were flown to Iran for elaborate ceremonies celebrating Iranian independence, even as the country remained economically and politically subordinate to Western powers. Religious opposition, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini from exile in Iraq, provided the ideological framework for resistance to the Shah's regime and its Western backers. Khomeini's message was revolutionary not just in its call for Islamic government, but in its explicit rejection of Western imperial domination. He portrayed the struggle against the Shah as part of a broader war between Islamic civilization and Western imperialism, resonating with Iranians who had experienced 150 years of foreign exploitation. The revolution that erupted in 1978 caught Western intelligence services completely unprepared. Despite their extensive surveillance networks and billions of dollars in intelligence gathering, CIA assessments as late as 1978 predicted the Shah's survival, demonstrating the fundamental weakness of imperial intelligence, the inability to understand colonized peoples except through the lens of their own imperial interests. As massive demonstrations swept across Iran, the Shah, military trained and equipped with billions of dollars in American weapons, proved unwilling to massacre Iranian civilians on the scale necessary to preserve the monarchy. Many officers, themselves from middle-class backgrounds, sympathized with protesters' demands for political freedom and economic justice. The revolution's success demonstrated that even the most sophisticated client regimes could collapse when they lost popular legitimacy. The Carter administration's response revealed the limitations of American imperial power when faced with genuine popular uprising. Torn between supporting an increasingly unpopular dictator and attempting to work with moderate opposition forces, American policy appeared both indecisive and hypocritical. Carter's 1977 praise for Iran as an island of stability became a symbol of American disconnect from Iranian reality, reinforcing popular perceptions that America would support any regime that served its interests, regardless of that regime's treatment of its own people. The hostage crisis that began on November 4, 1979, when revolutionary students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, marked the beginning of sustained American economic warfare against Iran. While Western media focused on the dramatic images of blindfolded diplomats and flag-burning crowds, the crisis's deeper significance lay in how it provided justification for comprehensive economic sanctions designed to strangle Iran's economy and topple its revolutionary government. The students' demands return of the Shah to face trial and an end to American interference in Iranian affairs were rooted in decades of justified grievances against U.S. imperial domination. The embassy itself had served as the nerve center for CIA operations in Iran since the 1953 coup, making it a legitimate target for revolutionaries seeking to end American control over their country. But rather than acknowledging the historical context of Iranian anger, American officials portrayed the hostage-taking as unprovoked terrorism, using it to justify economic warfare that continues today. President Carter's response established the template for modern American sanctions warfare. Executive orders froze all Iranian assets in U.S. banks, approximately $12 billion, while prohibiting American companies from doing business with Iran. These unilateral sanctions were then leveraged into multilateral pressure as the United States convinced allies to impose their own restrictions on Iranian trade and investment. The sanctions regime expanded systematically over the following decades, targeting every sector of Iran's economy while claiming to avoid harm to ordinary Iranians. Financial sanctions made it nearly impossible for Iran to conduct international transactions, while technology embargoes prevented Iranian companies from accessing equipment needed for industrial development. Oil sanctions, the ultimate economic weapon, sought to deprive Iran of the revenues needed to maintain government services and economic stability. These measures weren't simply policy tools, they were acts of economic warfare designed to inflict maximum suffering on Iranian society in hopes of generating popular uprising against the Islamic Republic. American officials openly admitted that sanctions were intended to create economic hardship that would turn Iranians against their government, a strategy that meets the definition of collective punishment under international law. The Iran-Iraq War that began in September 1980 provided the United States with an opportunity to weaken Iran through proxy warfare while maintaining official neutrality. Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran, launched with American intelligence support and Saudi financial backing, was designed to exploit Iran's post-revolutionary weakness and potentially overthrow the Islamic Republic through military defeat. American support for Iraq during this 8-year conflict revealed the cynical nature of U.S. claims to support international law and human rights. Despite Iraq's use of chemical weapons against Iranian forces, documented by UN inspectors and condemned by international organizations, the Reagan administration continued providing Iraq with intelligence, military equipment, and diplomatic cover. The scale of American assistance to Iraq was enormous and systematic. Satellite intelligence helped Iraqi forces target Iranian positions, while American naval forces in the Persian Gulf protected Iraqi oil shipments that funded the war effort. When Iran threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz in response to Iraqi attacks on its shipping, the U.S. Navy launched Operation Earnest Will, escorting Kuwaiti tankers while refusing similar protection to Iranian vessels. Chemical weapons attacks, which killed and injured thousands of Iranian soldiers and civilians, were met with silence from American officials who had previously condemned similar attacks when conducted by enemies of the United States. The message was clear. International law applied only when it served American interests, while American enemies could be subjected to any level of warfare without consequences. The war's conclusion in 1988, with both sides exhausted and Iran's economy devastated, achieved American strategic objectives without requiring direct military intervention. Iran's revolutionary government had survived but was weakened, while the 8-year conflict had prevented Iran from projecting influence throughout the Middle East during its most vulnerable period. Perhaps most significantly, the Iran-Iraq War established the precedent for using regional proxies to wage warfare against Iran while maintaining plausible deniability. This strategy, supporting local allies in conflicts with Iran while avoiding direct confrontation, would become central to American policy in the decades that followed. The end of the Cold War might have provided an opportunity for U.S.-Iran reconciliation, but American imperial strategists viewed Iran's survival as a threat to their vision of global dominance. President George W. Bush's inclusion of Iran in his Axis of Evil speech in 2002, just months after Iran had provided crucial assistance to American operations against the Taliban in Afghanistan, demonstrated that cooperation with the United States was impossible as long as Iran maintained its independence. Iran's cooperation in Afghanistan had been extensive and vital to American success. Iranian intelligence provided detailed information about Taliban positions, while Iranian diplomats helped broker agreements between various Afghan factions. Iran's Northern Alliance partners played crucial roles in the Taliban's defeat, while Iranian ports facilitated humanitarian aid to Afghan civilians. This cooperation reflected pragmatic Iranian recognition that Taliban-controlled Afghanistan posed threats to Iranian security as well as American interests. But rather than reciprocating this cooperation, the Bush administration treated Iranian assistance as evidence of weakness that could be exploited through increased pressure. The Axis of Evil speech, delivered while Iranian officials were still cooperating with American operations in Afghanistan, convinced Iranian leaders that no level of cooperation would satisfy American demands for Iranian submission. The 2003 Iranian offer of comprehensive Negotiations, including discussions of Iran's nuclear program support for Palestinian groups and relations with Israel, was ignored by an American administration confident that military success in Iraq would soon allow them to impose regime change on Iran as well. This missed opportunity for diplomatic breakthrough reflected the fundamental American preference for military dominance over negotiated settlements with independent nations. The Iraq War's chaos provided Iran with unexpected strategic opportunities while demonstrating the limits of American military power. Rather than creating a stable pro-American government in Baghdad, the invasion removed Iran's primary regional enemy while creating conditions for expanded Iranian influence among Iraq's Shia majority. American military superiority, so decisive in conventional warfare, proved inadequate for controlling complex political situations in occupied territories. Iran's nuclear program, which began under the Shah with American assistance, became the focal point of Western pressure tactics after the 1979 revolution. While Iranian leaders consistently denied any intention to build nuclear weapons, the program's symbolic importance as evidence of Iranian technological independence made it a natural target for Western attempts to demonstrate Iranian weakness and dependency. The program's history revealed the hypocrisy of Western non-proliferation policy. Under the Shah, when Iran served Western interests, American companies actively promoted Iranian nuclear development, providing reactors, enriched uranium, and technical training. The Ford administration even encouraged Iranian development of a complete nuclear fuel cycle, including uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing capabilities that could produce weapons-grade material. After the revolution, identical facilities and technologies were suddenly portrayed as threats to regional and global security. The same uranium enrichment capabilities that had been encouraged under the Shah became evidence of Iranian nuclear weapons ambitions under the Islamic Republic. This transformation revealed that Western non-proliferation policy was never about preventing nuclear weapons proliferation. It was about maintaining Western monopoly over advanced nuclear technology. Iran's insistence on maintaining its nuclear program despite enormous economic and political pressure reflected deeper issues of sovereignty and technological independence. For Iranian leaders, accepting permanent limitations on their nuclear capabilities would legitimize the principle that independent nations must remain technologically inferior to Western powers. The nuclear program became a symbol of Iran's refusal to accept permanent subordinate status in the international system. International sanctions targeting Iran's nuclear program expanded to cover virtually every sector of the Iranian economy, creating humanitarian consequences that exceeded those of many military conflicts. Banking sanctions made it nearly impossible for Iranian hospitals to purchase medical equipment, while restrictions on dual-use technologies prevented Iranian universities from accessing scientific instruments needed for research and education. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action represented a temporary compromise that provided sanctions relief in exchange for strict limitations on Iran's nuclear program. For several years, the agreement demonstrated that negotiated settlements were possible when both sides showed flexibility and recognized each other's core interests. However, President Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018 despite Iranian compliance verified by international inspectors destroyed this diplomatic progress while demonstrating that American commitments were worthless as long as Iran refused to accept permanent subordination. The reimposition of sanctions, combined with threats of military action against any country doing business with Iran, showed that American maximum pressure was simply economic warfare by another name. Iran's support for regional proxy groups represents its primary means of responding to Western pressure without risking direct military confrontation. Unable to match American or Israeli conventional military power, Iran has built networks of relationships with non-state actors throughout the Middle East who share common interests in resisting Western and Israeli domination of the region. These relationships with Hezbollah in Lebanon, various Iraqi militias, the Houthis in Yemen, and Palestinian resistance groups serve multiple strategic purposes. They provide Iran with the ability to pressure American allies without direct confrontation, create multiple fronts that would complicate any military attack on Iran, and demonstrate Iranian influence to domestic audiences who expect their government to resist Western pressure. Western characterization of these groups as Iranian proxies misunderstands the nature of these relationships, which are based on shared ideological opposition to Western imperialism rather than simple financial dependency. Groups like Hezbollah have deep indigenous roots and popular support that exists independently of Iranian assistance, making them partners in resistance rather than mere instruments of Iranian policy. The regional proxy network also serves as insurance against regime change attempts. Any Western-sponsored effort to overthrow Iran's government would face resistance not just within Iran but throughout the Middle East, raising the costs of intervention beyond what American policymakers are willing to accept. This asymmetric deterrent has proven more effective than conventional military capabilities in preventing direct Western attack on Iran. American responses to Iranian proxy activities have typically involved supporting counter-proxies, particularly Israel and Saudi Arabia, while avoiding direct confrontation with Iranian forces. This has created a pattern of regional conflicts where local grievances are intensified by great power competition, with civilian populations bearing the primary costs of proxy warfare between Iran and its enemies. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran represented the culmination of decades of American economic warfare, combining comprehensive sanctions with threats of military action against any nation or company doing business with Iran. This policy went beyond traditional sanctions to create what amounted to economic siege warfare designed to collapse Iran's economy and generate popular uprising against the Islamic Republic. The campaign's scope was unprecedented in its comprehensiveness. Primary sanctions prohibited all American individuals and companies from doing business with Iran, while secondary sanctions threatened to cut off any foreign entity that maintained Iranian relationships from the American financial system. This extraterritorial application of American law effectively forced global companies to choose between Iranian and American markets, a choice that inevitably favored the larger American economy. Oil sanctions, the campaign's centerpiece, sought to reduce Iranian petroleum exports to zero through threats against any country purchasing Iranian crude. While this goal was not fully achieved, Iranian oil exports dropped from over 2.5 million barrels per day in 2017 to less than 500,000 barrels per day by 2019, depriving Iran's government of crucial revenues needed for economic development and social services. Banking sanctions made it nearly impossible for Iran to conduct international financial transactions, forcing Iranian companies to resort to barter arrangements and complex financial structures that added enormous costs to routine business activities. The exclusion of Iranian banks from the SWIFT international messaging system effectively cut Iran off from the global financial system, creating conditions comparable to wartime blockade. The humanitarian consequences of maximum pressure sanctions were severe and deliberate. Medical sanctions prevented Iranian hospitals from accessing life-saving medications and equipment, while restrictions on spare parts grounded civilian aircraft and created dangerous flying conditions. These measures, which directly targeted Iranian civilians, were designed to create popular pressure for regime change while maintaining American claims that sanctions only targeted government officials. The policy is failure to achieve regime change despite creating enormous economic hardship demonstrated the limitations of economic warfare against governments with popular legitimacy and ideological commitment. Rather than generating uprising against the Islamic Republic, maximum pressure sanctions unified Iranian society against American pressure while strengthening hardline elements who had always argued that compromise with the United States was impossible. The Biden administration's approach to Iran has combined rhetorical changes with substantial policy continuity, reflecting the bipartisan American consensus that Iran must be pressured into accepting permanent subordinate status rather than treated as an equal sovereign nation. While Biden officials have criticized Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA and expressed willingness to return to nuclear diplomacy, they have maintained most sanctions while adding new restrictions targeting Iranian military and intelligence capabilities. Attempts to revive nuclear negotiations have foundered on fundamental disagreements about sequencing and scope. Iran demands sanctions relief before making new nuclear commitments, while the United States insists on nuclear compliance before providing economic benefits. This chicken and egg problem reflects deeper issues of trust and sovereignty that cannot be resolved through technical negotiations alone. The Biden administration has also expanded the scope of American pressure to include Iran's regional activities and human rights record, making comprehensive sanctions relief contingent on Iranian acceptance of American positions across multiple issue areas. This maximalist approach ensures continued conflict by demanding Iranian concessions on issues central to its sovereignty and security. Regional developments have further complicated diplomatic efforts. Israeli attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities and assassinations of Iranian scientists have strengthened hardline positions in Tehran while demonstrating the risks of cooperation with Western powers. Iranian retaliation against Israeli and American targets has provided justification for continued pressure tactics while creating new sources of conflict. The fundamental problem remains unchanged. American demands for Iranian submission are incompatible with Iranian demands for sovereignty and respect. Until this core contradiction is addressed, tactical adjustments in American policy are unlikely to produce meaningful diplomatic breakthroughs. Over 150 years of Western warfare against Iran, economic, political, and military has created profound consequences that extend far beyond Iran's borders. The systematic use of coups, sanctions, and proxy conflicts has demonstrated to other developing nations that independence from Western control comes at enormous cost, encouraging submission to imperial demands rather than resistance. For Iran itself, the costs have been measured not just in economic losses, but in human development opportunities foregone. Resources that might have built schools, hospitals, and infrastructure have instead been diverted to military capabilities needed to resist Western pressure. The brain drain of educated Iranians seeking opportunities abroad has deprived Iran of talent needed for economic development while enriching Western nations with Iranian human capital. The regional consequences have been equally severe. Western support for proxy conflicts and client regimes has prevented the emergence of stable, independent governments throughout the Middle East. The pattern of intervention established in Iran using economic pressure and military threats to maintain compliant governments has been replicated across the region with consistently destructive results. Perhaps most significantly, the Iran case has demonstrated the limits of imperial power in the modern era. Despite commanding enormous economic and military advantages, Western powers have been unable to force Iranian submission after 4 decades of sustained pressure. Iran's survival and continued independence have inspired other nations to resist Western demands while providing practical examples of how asymmetric strategies can neutralize conventional military superiority. The story of Western warfare against Iran serves as a powerful reminder that empires create their own enemies through the arrogance of domination. Iran's transformation from potential partner to implacable enemy resulted directly from Western decisions to prioritize control over cooperation, submission over sovereignty. The missed opportunities for reconciliation from the 1995 Conoco deal to the 2003 Iranian offer of comprehensive negotiations reveal how imperial thinking prevents recognition of mutual interests that might serve both sides better than continued conflict. Each escalation of pressure has strengthened Iranian resolve while weakening Western influence throughout the region. The human costs of this prolonged conflict, measured in Iranian lives shortened by sanctions, regional instability caused by proxy warfare, and global resources wasted on military competition, demonstrate the moral bankruptcy of imperial strategies that treat entire populations as expendable in pursuit of geopolitical advantage. As new challenges emerge, from climate change to great power competition with China and Russia, the continuation of Western warfare against Iran appears increasingly counterproductive to genuine Western interests. The resources devoted to containing Iran might be better used addressing global challenges that threaten all nations regardless of their political systems. Yet breaking the cycle of imperial warfare would require Western recognition that Iran's independence is not a threat to be eliminated but a reality to be accepted. Such recognition would represent a fundamental challenge to imperial ideology that views any independent center of power as an unacceptable challenge to Western dominance. The echoes of 1953 still reverberate today, shaping a conflict that has outlasted the Cold War and shows little sign of resolution. Whether future generations will finally escape this cycle of imperial warfare and counter-resistance remains one of the most important unanswered questions in contemporary international relations. The answer will determine not just the future of U.S.-Iran relations, but the broader question of whether the 21st century will witness the emergence of a genuinely multipolar world order or the continuation of imperial domination by other means.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more engaging historical content.